Hi all, let's have a look at the amazing game in round 2 between Peter Svidler and Dmitry Andreikin. So Svidler, playing white, kicked off with e4, and Dmitry Andreikin played Sicilian, and after knight f3, knight c6, and after d4 he took, knight takes d4, and here I'm quite a fan of the Sicilian Svechnikov sometimes with knight f6, but in this game we see an immediate e5, which is slightly different to that, slightly different relative, but it still weakens the d5 square, but it gives black a very interesting game. It's called the Kalashnikov, or sometimes Sicilian Lowenthal and Kalashnikov variations. So white plays knight b5 here, and black could still, I think, play something like knight f6, that's been played before, or even a6. So knight d6 is not such a killer threat, but it is reacted to now with d6. And because black hasn't forced white to play knight c3, white has the luxury now of setting up the dreaded Rxc binds. So these two pawns here bind against black ever playing d5, or trying to discourage d5. So Rxc was a very famous player, actually quite famous for getting into time trouble in a lot of his games, but this bind structure came from him, from his name. So bishop e7, this seems like quite a logical thing to do, with the white pawns like this on light squares. Exchanging off the dark square bishop should leave white a bit weaker on the dark squares. White now plays knight 1 to c3, that's a standard move, a6, standard move so far, bishop e6, and here often knight c2 is played, as well as what was played, which is bishop e2, and there's bishop g5, exchanging off the dark squared bishop. This is actually the main move here. If we just have a look at this position, knight f6 is actually infrequently played. It will leave black with quite a cramped game. This is quite undesirable, and technically as far as past games, white's known to get a small advantage here. For example, like this, black has a fairly cramped game. That bishop is just stuck behind the pawn on d6. The Rxc bind is actually working wonders here to cramp, in effect, the bishop, not just the structure, because the structure works with the pieces here. So it's very logical to try and get rid of the dark squared bishop in this position. White often castles, as well as this next move, knight c2. Now black takes, rook takes. Now usually here, this is a theoretical departure, usually players with black actually play knight f6. I've got 53 games on live with knight f6, 8 with knight going to e7 here, this knight ge7, and only 4 now with what was played, which is actually queen g5. Queen g5 is a very interesting move, going for that g2, leaving behind d6. Let's examine the obvious. Pardon me. Let's examine the obvious to start off with. If queen takes d6, I don't think we want to do this particularly, because actually we lose the rook. Forget about g2, we actually just lose the rook. So d6 is not on, and white just castled here. Okay. Just before we go on though, in this line, just to show you, usually games might continue like this. This is quite a beaten path, for example, both sides castling, and the queen coming to b6. So contrast the queen on this g file with a queen just on b6, just pinning down this pawn. So black still has quite a cramped position, but it's playable. Black's got rid of that kind of bad piece, so it's kind of a playable position here. A lot of games we played with this sort of waiting game now behind the Rxc bind. So okay, this is a very, very interesting, surprising move, queen g5. So white castled, rook, the queen is actually now threatening queen takes d6 without losing a rook, so that's actually protected here with rook d8. Now interestingly, usually white doesn't white tries to preserve this bind by playing something like b3, which is a solid option, but in fact, Peter Svidler, he actually played quite aggressively here on the queen side with b4. So is this going to gain space? Is it something else about it? Okay, but the engine is actually really quite like white here, giving white an advantage, a small advantage with this move anyway. So knight f6, queen d3, black castles, rook fd1. So it looks quite nice behind this bind. Whereas black's counterplay, what is actually the queen doing here on g5? Would it have been better served on this diagonal because it would have been pinning this pawn? That's an interesting question. What is the queen actually doing here? We see rook c8 actually being played. And let's just check this out again out of interest. Queen takes d6. I think it's a disaster for some reason, or is it not? It actually is not losing for white, but it's better for black. So knight d4, harassing the queen. You don't want to get involved in this. You'd actually have to do a queen sack here. This is not particularly pleasant. It gets a bit crazy, but black ends up being better in this position. So there's no need to take on d6. That's a bit too adventurous. Peter Svidler, he plays knight d5, and black now takes an opportunity to try and target this c4 pawn. Perhaps it has a downside, this next move. It does expose structurally black under pressure potentially. Black played here b5. If we examine this at this moment, maybe bishop takes d5, seals the hole on d5, but after e takes, white has quite dangerous looking pawns here if only c5 can be played later, like knight e3 securing d5. So it looks as though there might be trouble ahead for black here with the pawn inertia. So perhaps this dissuaded black from this sort of plan. These pawns look potentially quite dangerous. I think white's technically doing okay. So what else does black do here? Yeah, so he played b5. It was quite an aggressive move on the queen side. Now here, very interesting. White has at least a couple of options, or maybe 2 or 3 options here. Taking on f6 might not be that advantageous in this position. This wasn't played. Knight takes f6 check. If we played g takes, now here with pressure on c4, what does white actually do? If c takes, then knight takes b4 is possible. On c1, that dreaded c1 square again is a nuisance. So actually, I think that explains why the engines in this position are looking at giving h4 as an idea, just to deflect the queen away from c1. And if takes, now we can take on b5 without the dreaded knight takes b4. So this position, though, is not much for white. Black is doing quite well here. So actually, instead of knight takes f6, what else is there? If c5, then d takes, b takes again, rook fd8 here. Pressure on d5 is quite a lot, and black, I think, is doing quite well now in this position. So what Peter Svidler played is actually, in circumstances, I think, a very powerful move here. After b5, he offers with this move a temporary pawn sacrifice, a centre pawn sacrifice with queen g3. So attacking the queen, but you might think e4's on here as well. So let's first examine knight takes e4. If knight takes e4, which wasn't played, then white could take on g5 and here play knight b6. This is actually quite a strong move in this position, hitting the rook. If the rook moves, say, to b8, then we can just take on d6, hitting c6, and if rook takes b6, c5. This is an advantage for white. This position, it's tricky for black. Okay, so that's interesting that knight takes e4 might slightly backfire here. So black actually played queen takes g3, but this leaves an intermediate knight takes f6 with check, so that the e4 pawn is not hanging. Now h takes g3, and then again, isn't this a pawn sacrifice? B takes c4 was played. Is bishop takes c4 any good as well? Is that the same sort of thing? Well, bishop takes c4 and rook takes d6 I think is sufficient for white to have a good position here. White can actually either protect this or even take this on f6 or just centralize the knight. A lot of pleasant options there exist. So okay, so black actually played b takes c4 here now. In this particular position, with the bishop on e6, actually rook takes d6 might be less effective now. After rook fd8, what does white do here? If he takes, black is actually doing quite nicely in this position. There'll be no problems here for black. But there's one move which does cause black an issue here. Instead of bishop takes c4, after b takes c4, white has a powerful move. I wonder if you can guess it. So you're temporarily a pawn down. So 6 pawns for white, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 for black. Temporarily a pawn down. There's slight control over d5 at the moment. This is protected. What would you play here with white? I think this is a fantastic move in the circumstances. It really fits the position very well. If I gave you 10 seconds starting from now, what would you play? Okay, the move f4 actually threatens f5, and then after bishop d7 there are nice choices. To demonstrate this, I mean, let's give black a token move like rook fd8, so f5, and we can either take on c4 or take on d6. So black is very keen to stop f5. He actually plays f5 himself, and this too has a downside though, to try and stop white from playing f5. This too has a downside. E takes, bishop takes, and now knight e3, and it looks as though black technically can hold on to the pawn now with what he played, which is or at least give back the pawn under the most favourable circumstances. Pardon me. Bishop d3. White now, though, is not obliged to simply try and restore material equality here immediately. Although he does take on d3, it's not with the intention of rook takes d3 here. This doesn't even quite work in this position because knight takes b4 is a real nuisance. And if rook takes, black has knight takes d3 and black should be fine. No, in this position another very, very powerful delicate move is played, which creates very serious issues for black. Can you guess what it is if I give you 10 seconds here? Okay, it's knight f5. This guarantees white a clear advantage. In fact, there's tactical threats like rook takes c6 and knight e7 check have emerged. That's like the principal threat. Okay, what does black actually do? It's quite a dire position, in fact. What can black do here about this? If he moves, let's say just moving his king out of interest, let's just move the king, then actually knight takes d6 embarrasses the rook. I think this was talked about in post-mortem. F takes and black's dead here. He can't move his rooks. There's that horrible pin. Black would be totally dead. I think white can just either protect the pawn and then scoop up the pawn later as well. And black is just in big trouble. I don't think taking the pawn here though, the knight takes b4, this tactics, white can just proceed cautiously with a big advantage here. Just king f2 for example. Okay, so black, he can't really do that. King h8 just shows that d6 can just be taken here. He played a very interesting move. If we just check this again, rook fd8, rook takes c6, then knight e7 check, just to convince ourselves this position is a bit sharper, and I think was checked out as well in post-mortem, a similar position anyway. This should be okay for white, although the black pawns look very scary. So say knight a5, which might not be the best, but e4, king f2. I think the black pawns can be stopped if the king comes to e3. There's a comfortable blockade, but this is a bit on the tricky side. Peter Svidler didn't really go in for this. I mean, sorry, rook fd8 wasn't played in any case. Black actually played e4, and it was after a kind of diamond formation of pawns, I think. If rook takes c6 here, this is still quite tricky. Rook takes check, knight takes c6. This position might be a little bit tricky. Say rook c4. The pawns need to be factored in as being quite dangerous, but white does stand technically better. Instead, I mean, that looks so obvious by rook takes c6. Instead we see another great move instead, knight takes d6. Just content with an edge in the rook and pawn ending. A much clearer edge, really. And black here proceeded to sacrifice his rook with e3. If he just plays, well, what else does he play? If he plays rook c7, this is pretty hopeless. Knight takes e4, and all the pawns are dropping off. And there's this horrible pin. There's no rook e8, even knight f6 check. So this is quite a desperate state of affairs here. So okay, e3 was played, giving up the rook, and now d2. Okay, we have two connected passed pawns, which normally would be very dangerous, but white is just taking a lot of material here, and after e2 can just retreat the rook, giving back a rook and transitioning into a slightly favourable rook and pawn ending. Well, a winning rook and pawn ending, in fact. So e takes, rook takes c8. The black pawns are eliminated, leaving white with two pawns up. But you might say, well, these are doubled. But the thing is, the 2-to-1 here is quite decisive in itself. Black tried here rook c3, and this gives white a very, very powerful move indeed against like these two ideas. There's rook d5, and black actually resigned here on move 31. If rook takes g3, then rook g5 taking the rooks off, and then 2 to 1 will win quite easily. And if rook a3, pardon me, rook a3, then not rook d2, which would be passive and not going anywhere particularly, but just rook a5 evicting that rook, or going into a position which is technically winning for white. If we have rook takes a5, b takes, let's have a quick look at this king and pawn ending. King f8, king f2. Let's bring the black king out. I think white can just proceed like this, even allowing h5, which seemingly fixes that. That's okay. This king and pawn ending should be very favourable for white. Say f6, and then it takes an extra while to get rid of this pawn. So if black got rid of this pawn, there's this extra pawn, so I can just go after these pawns, for example, and go after the f7 pawn. And I think black's just taking far too much time to get out of the way here. The f6 pawn is already quite ready to queen, so this doesn't work. This just doesn't work. That kind of scenario, it shows is actually quite advantageous to have that extra pawn here. So after this rook a5, this looks like a fairly hopeless king and pawn ending. If we just run through another scenario, I mean, there's even white could even play g4 here to stop any h5 business as well. That might be a slight improvement as well. And say black doesn't go after this pawn. So here, g5, because there's the extra pawn here, which is also handy to use to restrain. We're restraining 2 pawns for the price of 1 here. I think lots of moves win. So f5, king e5. I think black's getting into zugzwang with this extra pawn here. White can just play g3, and now black is conceding the f6 square. And if the king goes to g7, that's terminal. So yeah, if rook a5 really wins this, because it's winning the a6 pawn, so that would be hopeless. That would be two pawns to nothing. So after this rook d5, black resigned. If he tries a check, again we're just going to play rook a5, and if the black rook becomes passive like this, now this position, let's have a quick look at this scenario with the rook left on. King comes up. Let's just bring the king over, or maybe actually just a4. Let's go with a4. This pawn's a problem here. I think f5 will do. b5 creating a pass pawn. Say black tries to block, then a5. It's just a hopeless rook and pawn ending here. Okay, so it did seem to be a great decision to go into this rook and pawn ending, rather than, so you navigated away from the complexity of playing rook takes c6, which would seem one of the main points would have been rook takes c6 here, which black's encouraging, but all of that was avoided with knight takes d6. So quite masterful play, and I think it's that mountain climbing metaphor in endpoint theory, where as humans we just need to win the game as safely as possible, and we don't have to enter these major complications when there's a safer win available. And here it looks as though the rook and pawn ending is absolutely much easier than the other positions. So knight takes d6 as opposed to rook takes c6. Quite an interesting decision there, but one which works out very well. Okay, comments or questions on YouTube? Hope you enjoyed that one. Thanks very much.